Well, welcome, folks. It's good to see you all again. Here we are around this campfire, and we're going to tell some stories and enjoy each other's company. Christmas is right here. I hope y'all are going to have a good Christmas and get to see some family or friends, and a little celebration, and then be thankful for what this is all about. Tonight I want to read you a little more Dan Barry's Daughter, so find yourself a place to sit around the fire here and get comfortable. We'll get started. Chapter 13, that is. Throwing Dice with Death. Now that the girl was gone, the center of attention was the horse. And with that horse was unlucky Judd Carter as the cynosure of all eyes. "And what," said someone, "do you aim to do with that hoss, Judd?" "Why," announced Judd, still somewhat crestfallen over that sudden disappearance of the girl, but his eye brightening as he looked over the racy lines of Peter. "I reckon that I can use him well enough, couldn't you?" "Well, maybe I could," said the other, "but I don't know that I would." "Well, what might you be meaning by that?" "Why do you think that most of the gents were bidding in on that hoss?" "Why, I don't know." "Well, ain't it true that there ain't a man here that would want to pay $500 for one hoss when he could get 5 hosses that'd be good to work cattle with?" "Well, maybe that's true." "Then why'd they all bid up?" "Why, matter of fact, they was trying to help that girl out of the trouble that made her need $500. Judd came from a thrifty family. He looked about him in amazement. "You mean to say that they wanted to give away $500? "No," was the response, "because they figured that it was worth that much to get an introduction to the girl." Well, Judd Carter passed a work-hardened hand across his forehead. But before his wits had cleared after this argument, and while he was still surrounded by men who were striving to show him an impossible point of view, he was removed from his difficulties by a new intervention. For Joan herself had come slowly down the street and through the crowd and went straight to Judd. She carried in her hand still that same money which he had given her, and coming to him, she looked up in his face with great, fear-stricken, wistful eyes. "Do you think," she asked, "that I could buy Peter back from you for just as much as you paid? Here's the same money, you see." It was the smile from heaven for Judd. He had been swept off his feet a little before with all the others around him, but the thought of losing $500 or the respect of the community had sobered his close-figuring brain completely. His throat closed so tight that he could only reach for the money with one hand and gesture to Peter with the other. All in an instant, Joan had given a faint cry of joy and was back in the saddle. A twitch of the reins, and Peter was through the midst of them. A word, and he was kicking the dust behind him as he galloped down the street. And for those who had done the bidding for Peter a little while before, they glanced after her with the wistful eyes of youth, seeing that one has only to turn the corner with any man in order to find him in his boyhood again. But while they were still gaping and had not said a word, news came hobbling out to them in the form of the old man, who was the office boy, janitor, and all-round messenger of the courthouse, with more knowledge about each office in the old building than had any of the very tenants themselves. It was he who now spread the word. How he knew no one could guess, for Judge Conley had certainly not told him, but perhaps the walls in that building were overly thin, or else keyholes were overly large. At any rate, he bore tidings of everything. Of how the girl had come with $500 bail to get Sandy Williams free, and of how the judge had placed before her a telegram announcing that Williams was no other than certain Harry Gloucester, who had killed 2 men a week before, and therefore he was not open to bail of any amount. Now this was the news which sent a buzz of wonder through the town. It was a salve for the battered jaws and the sore ribs of men who had stood up to Harry Gloucester the night before and found themselves going down like ninepins. For after all, a man who was capable of a double murder was capable of almost anything. But the only one who felt no thrill of excitement was Lee Haines. For when he heard the news, it seemed as though a weight had fallen upon his shoulders, bowing him, and that a shadow had dropped across his eyes. At any rate, he went slowly back to that hotel, rented his room for another day, and when in the room, he first of all carefully removed the bandage from his right hand. That hand was stiff, and the ragged wound in the palm was still unhealed. But making a grimace from the pain it caused him, he began to open and shut the fingers. A few drops of blood oozed out as he continued, but he kept working until the hand was supple. After that, to rest the aching nerves of his hand, he lay on his back on the bed, ran his eyes over the cracks on the ceiling. And for every branching and turning of the long cracks above him, he found branchings and turnings in his own life. He could read them as if they were notes to freshen his memory and bring up to his mind all that he had ever done or seen. And he had done too much, and he had seen too much, so that from time to time he would close his eyes and relax, outworn by the effort. And at such times, his face relaxing, the flesh about his mouth and under his eyes sank in a little so that his face was like a death mask, or like death itself. The day sloped into the quiet and the shadow of the evening, when he was aware of the incessant beat and metal hammering in the blacksmith's shop by its cessation, when the subdued voices which had gone on all the day were hushed away. There were single calls from children in the streets, or bursts of laughter from a group of merrymakers. Then he sat up on the bed slowly and leaned his head into his hands. There he sat until the darkness was complete. And when he began to move again, it was such a faltering slowness that, indeed, he seemed a feeble old feller who had lived out the appointed 70, instead of a burly and vigorous man in the latter prime of life. However, what he was doing had a significance which was young enough. He was looking to his revolver, and he was looking to it in the utter blackness of the dark. His fingers seemed to have eyes for that work. They worked swiftly, and yet were unhurried. The big weapon was first unloaded, and then it was taken apart, all in the dark, and all in the dark it was reassembled. And the shells inserted again, and the cylinder was spun, and the action was as smooth as silk. If anyone could have watched, they would have wondered not so much as the thing which was done, but that any man would have spent all the countless hours that must have been required in practice, for he could have become so familiar with all the parts of a revolver that he would know each of them by the touch. But such, however, was the skill of Lee Haines, and the fact that he had such a skill threw a sharp light down his past. When his gun was ready and loaded once more, he was still not ready. He lighted a lamp, drew his shade, and spent an hour in a strange practice, which consisted of jerking the gun from the holster on his thigh with lightning speed and leveling it at some object in the room, which might be the knob on the door or the highlight which lay along the rim of the bowl on the washstand. Then he began to walk softly to and fro in the room, and when the impulse moved him, he jerked out his weapon and whirled, aiming it again. They were adroit movements, but always they appeared to disappoint Haines. And finally he went to the stained and cracked mirror, and holding the lamp above his head, he examined his face with a care which plainly showed that he considered himself an old man. After he set down the lamp, he clapped the hat on his head, however, and went straight down the stairs to the rear of the hotel, and thence to the stable which was behind it. And there he entered a stall in which was a great black stallion, a giant of his kind, yet built for speed as well as strength. In the days of old he could have galloped at high speed with all the crushing impost of a knight in full armor upon his back. Even the solid bulk of so big a man as Lee Haines would be nothing to his strength. He could trot along all day, just as a range mustang could trot under the burden of an ordinary man. He saddled the great black horse, arranged a pack behind the saddle, all with the consummate care of one who knows that little details count most in big affairs, and then led that spirited animal out and mounted. His journey led straight down the street of the village where the greatest number of eyes would fall upon him. But the moment he was clear of the outskirts of town, he turned to the left and made a swift semicircle which brought him back to the vicinity of the jail. And here he dismounted. There was a thicket behind the building. It had been cleared away for 10 paces, but after this the brush was thick and high enough to hide a mounted man. Here he threw the reins of the black horse and dismounted, and as he did so he heard a girl's voice singing, not far away, a Mexican waltz song. Que viva la rumba, que viva placer. He listened to the singing for a moment. There was something so joyous and careless in it that it made his mood of the moment darker than ever. She might be still singing, this happy passer-by, when guns were sounding in the jail. After that, he went forward again, circled the building, and came to the front entrance. It was surrounded by a group of men talking idly of idle things, but there was no doubt that they had been drawn there by the knowledge that a murderer was inside. The door to the office was open, and in it were Sim Hargis, his deputy, with a half-dozen others. Lee Haines picked Hargis from the rest and drew him to one side. "Sheriff," he said, "I have something of importance to tell you. It has to do with your man, Harry Gloucester, inside." "Well, let's have it then." "Rather have you alone when I tell it." The sheriff regarded him for a moment of doubt. Then he sent the others from the room and shut the door behind him. "I guess you've got no objection to George staying," he said. "I'd rather have you alone, Sheriff." Again, the sheriff hesitated. But eventually, with a shrug, he bade George follow the others. "Now, you mind if I lock that door behind him?" asked Haines, doing the thing before he received an answer. "What the devil?" growled Hargis. "You afraid that they'll break in to hear what you have to say?" "They'd spoil everything for me," answered Haines seriously, "if they should hear. Sit down, Sheriff. It won't take me long once I'm started to—" He stepped to a chair as he spoke, and the sheriff leaned to be seated, but as he did so his eyes caught on a glint of metal. He cursed softly and straightened again, staring into the muzzle of Haines' revolver. "Very neat, damn you," he said bitterly. "Sorry, Sheriff, but put them up quick. I'm pressed for time, even with the door locked." The sheriff raised his hands obediently. "The keys," demanded Haines. "On the desk there." "Thanks. What horse is that tied behind the jail?" "Mine." "I'm going to have to borrow that roan, Sheriff. Return him to you when I get a chance." "You'll sweat for this one of these days." "Most likely I will." "Step inside, will you?" He waved the jail entrance, and Sim Hargis obediently led the way. Obedience was in his manner, but not in his mind. However, for as he stepped through the door into the cell room, he leaped to the side of the door, and with a shout he drew his revolver as he whirled. That took Lee Haines by surprise. Otherwise, there would have been no time for even the shout. But as it was, he tapped the sheriff over the head with the long-barreled weapon which he carried. The sheriff dropped on his face, as loosely sprawling as if a 10-ton wagon had rolled over him. Outside the building there was an answering yell of inquiry from Deputy George, and at the door it was taken up by the clamor of a dozen voices. Chapter 14, Freedom Has Its Shackles. That calling transfixed the leisurely movements of Haines into a wild haste. He leapt to scoop up that gun, which was still clasped by the unnerved finger of the sheriff. Then he raced down the aisle to the cell of Harry Gloucester. "Harry," he called as he ran, "we're leaving together. Take this." He tossed that revolver to him. "Now, if I can find the key that fits this damn door—" He began to work feverishly, groaning as every key failed to fit the lock. Gloucester had merely scooped up his hat, placed it on his head, completing his readiness to leave. Now he took the revolver, spun it in his hand, tossed it onto his bunk. "I'll leave this where it'll do no harm," he said. "A gun like that is apt to do a lot of killing if a man doesn't look out." Haines favored him and the discarded weapon with a glance of rapt wonder. "Well, that's a fool's idea," he declared, but here the lock turned and the door was cast open by Gloucester's shoulder. "Now for the rear door," cried Haines. "Right outside the sheriff's horse is tied. Jump into the saddle. I'll cut the reins loose fast, Gloucester, for God's sake." Down the sides of the building ran voices, and at the front door there was a furious battering, and far away, up and down the village street, they could hear the shouts and the beatings of hooves as men, attracted by the clamor at the jail, threw themselves into the saddle and scurried for the scene of action. The two inside reached the rear door, twisted at the knob, and found it locked. It meant another search among the keys, and such a search meant a delay which would render all escape hopeless. Haines, with a groan, started to fit the keys. However, since even hopeless work is better than inaction. But Gloucester warned him away and stepped aside. A human battering ram went past him and hurled itself against the door. It was a stout door. The safety of the cells depended on that tool-proof steel of the bars alone, but nevertheless, all the approaches to the building were strongly blocked, and now the door flung back by the heavy body of Gloucester as if it were a rubber ball. He staggered away, found footing once more, and returned to the charge, shooting straight ahead, then swerving at the last instant and giving the wood the rubbery mass of muscle on his shoulder as a pad for his weight. The shock cracked the lock as if it were cast iron. The door flew open and spilled Gloucester into the outer night, where he was welcomed by a yell from a half a dozen throats. Lee Haines jumped out to join the fracas, his deadly long revolver poised, but Gloucester arose from the shadow at his feet where he had fallen and struck the weapon out of his hand. "No shooting for me," he commanded, and lunged at the sheriff's roan horse. As for Haines, with an oath of helpless anger, he stooped, caught up his fallen gun, and arose to find someone running straight on him, firing at every step. No doubt it was the jar of his own running that ruined the aim of the oncomer. But Haines had no time to find the trigger of his own weapon. He'd seized it by the barrel, and now he dashed the heavy butt into the face of his assailant. The man went down with a gasp, and Haines turned toward Gloucester long enough to see that the other was hopelessly lost. 3 men had thrown themselves upon him as he was wrenching apart the reins that tethered the roan, and Haines gave up a lost cause and raced for the shelter of the bush. He was neglected for the instant, as all the rest were focusing on Gloucester, and Lee ventured a glance back from the shrubbery. What he saw was Gloucester rising out of a cluster of men as if a dog shakes himself free from a scrambling, weak-toothed litter of puppies. Now one of the 3 was prostrate, a second went down at that instant as if struck with a club, and the third staggered away, and then, encouraged by the yells of a solid group which was charging to his assistance, dived in again to the attack. Haines saw him picked up and heaved into the air as if he were no more than the fragile body of a child, then flung into the faces of the onrushing men. The leaders went down under the blow, and those behind them were entangled, and before the tangle cleared, Gloucester was on the back of the roan and dashing for the crowded shadow of the shrubbery. He plunged past Haines, 3 steps away, and was gone with a crash among the young trees. On the scene of the battle, men were picking themselves up, cursing brokenly. A roar of guns followed, the bullets rattling through the brush. And Gloucester called hastily, "Haines, Haines, for God's sake, where are you?" He reined in his horse, needless of the bullets which were whistling near him. But there was no answer from Haines. Instead, a slenderer and smaller figure now rushed a horse out of the darkness where he had expected to see the other man come to join. He jerked his horse around and charged the newcomer to strike him to the ground. But the latter dodged with a horse as slippery as an eel. And the next instant, a girl's voice was crying to him, "Follow me, this way, ride hard." Amazement engulfed him, and then he rode as fast as that sheriff's horse would take him, in pursuit of the girl. She led him straight at a thick, low copse, but when he half expected to see her and her horse come to ruin in that wall of brush, they suddenly ducked out of sight into it. And at the very verge of the thicket he saw a narrow opening which twisted to the left, made by grazing cattle perhaps, breaking a path through to come at nearby water. He reined back the roan and wound through that brush at more than a moderate pace, coming out on the farther side into a little hollow which pointed down a shallow arroyo. And in that hollow was the girl waiting for him. "You've gained on him," she cried, clapping her hands together in her delight. They'll have to ride around that thicket to come on your trail again. Ride fast, ride hard, or if you stay at all, only stay to take my horse. There's nothing in the country that can come up with him for running." He could not believe his ears. Beyond the thicket, men were shouting, men were riding here and there, baffled by his disappearance. These were precious moments to put a distance down between himself and them, but instead of taking her advice, he pressed closer to her and peered into her face. The starlight was bright, bright enough to give him 1,000 hints of her beauty, and yet so dim that a shadow still lay across her features. "You're a girl," he said. "I knew that voice as well, as though I'd heard you singing the song." "Don't stop to talk," she cried. "Be gone at once. Don't you hear him? Don't you hear him?" In fact, the noise of the horses and of shouting was spreading behind them to either edge of the thicket. Before long, the riders would swarm out into that arroyo. "I can't leave till I know your name." "Joan. Joan Daniels. Now, quickly." "I'm not going yet. What brought you here?" "I don't know, except that something was telling me that perhaps," she broke off to say, pressing closer to him and putting a hand on his arm, "the 2 men that they say you killed, I never laid a hand on 'em. They were my partners, Joan. I came back from hunting, I found 'em dead, and I ran for it, 'cause I knew that I didn't have any defense. I knew you couldn't have done it. I knew it. But I wanted to hear what... I've been trying to draw your face, Joan, but everything that I've imagined has been wrong. You're 1,000 times more beautiful. I'd give a year of life to see you only once in the sunlight. You mustn't talk of that. Do you hear them coming? Don't you hear 'em riding around the thicket?" The hand on his arm trembled. He took it in both his own. As he drew her a little nearer, she raised her head and looked steadily up into his face. The noise of the riders faded from his mind. "What is your hair, Joan? In the starlight it only looks like a pale glow of light. Is it gold?" "It's yellow hair," she said. "It's metal gold," he answered. "And what color are your eyes, Joan?" "Blue. Now go, Harry. For God's sake, go." "You're not happy with me here?" "So happy it's like sadness. Oh, being near you is a wild happiness, and when I touch you, it's as though I took all of your strength into my hand. And when I touch you, Joan, I feel as if I've taken the blue out of the sky and all the gold out of the mountains and all the laughing and the singing out of the world." "Hush," she pleaded. "If you say such things, I'll be begging you to stay. And now they come. Oh, don't you see? What do I care? I'm living a year every second. I've spent a whole life of happiness right here trying to tell you how much I love you, Joan, but the words don't tell you what I mean. Then for God's sake, go. Ask me again, Joan, for my sake. And you care for me just a little to begin with?" "Yes." Then he took her in his arms, but with her face raised to his, something weakened and snapped in him. And in her face and her eyes he found a solemn power which kept him from touching her with his lips. Another moment, he was spurring away for freedom. Chapter 15, The Valley of the Shadow. It was just as Gloucester plunged into the woods near the jail that a bullet struck Haines. And there was a sting of irony that went almost as deep as the plunging bullet in the knowledge that he was struck by a random shot. After the 1,000 dangers he had faced, to be killed by accident? He thought of all that as he sagged against a tree trunk, watching with dim eyes the shadowy horsemen who were racing through the woods in the pursuit of the escaped man. Then as he strove to get to that black stallion his foot caught, he fell heavily and struck the side of his head against a stump. He lay only a few moments on the ground, but it seemed to him an eternity. He was faint and weak when his eyes opened again, and the roar of voices in the town and about the jail had grown into a heavy chorus. He felt of the blood which trickled from his wounds where the bullet had entered and left his body, and he knew that he was indeed no better than a dead man. What he wanted most of all was to get into the open, lie flat on his back, and watching the cold stars grow dim, so die. If only he could find water in the sands, for a fire of thirst was burning in him, closing his dry throat. Stumbling on in this fashion through the wood, with shadows already swinging before his eyes, he ran against a projecting branch, a stiff and strong-tipped bow which cut against the wound. He clapped his hand over the place and felt the blood gush, and staggered weakly on towards that black horse. The stallion remained honestly where he had been placed, but his low neigh of greeting came faint and far to lee. He reached for the pommel, and then found that he'd never have the strength to pull himself into the saddle. "Lee Haines," someone was calling. "Not he," answered Haines, staggering as he turned. "Not Haines, Gloucester. Come get me and be damned to you." And then his misting eyes saw that it was only a girl who stood before him, and he knew that it was a girl's voice that had spoken. "It is Haines," she was crying eagerly. "Where's Gloucester?" "He's gone as fast as a fast horse can take him away." "Thank God." They were interrupted by a rushing of men and horses through the brush, and the clamor of a score of voices calling. Already, the light cavalry of the town had swept into the pursuit. Others were following. A cluster plunged past the girl and Haines not a dozen feet away, but they were looking for moving figures, and these stationary shadows remained unseen. "Why aren't you riding?" she asked. "Riding?" Haines echoed. "I'll go as far as water and stay there. Is there water near here?" He coughed. The excruciating pain stopped his voice. She stepped close to him, and as the agony abated a little, he could see that it was the girl who had sold Peter that day and brought him back again. "You're wounded, badly," she was saying. "I'm nicked. Nothing bad. If you can tell me where there's water," and he stumbled and would have fallen, but her shoulder caught under him and held him strongly up. She drew one of his dangling arms around her neck. Her right arm she passed around him, and now half his weight slumped lifelessly upon her. "Try to walk, slowly," she gasped, and they staggered on through the darkness. "Doesn't amount to anything," she heard him say. "I'll just tie up the place they nicked me. Be all right in a minute. Go on along about your business. Nobody must find you with me." But no matter how bravely he talked, she saw that his head had fallen far forward, so that he was blinded to the way they went, and every moment the weight she was carrying increased. There was a wild fear inside of her. She felt that at any moment it might overtake her and paralyze her. And so she fought it back savagely and centered all her mind on the need of the big man whose weight was lurching to and fro against her. She had seen an old cabin, more than half ruined, which stood among the trees, and to this she now led Lee Haines. He was barely past the door when he slumped down, his weight tearing away from her gripping hands, while he murmured, "I'll just sit down here to rest a minute. Be all right now. You run along now." His weakening voice and his fall told her 1,000 things more than his words. "Have you a match?" she cried. "Oh, quickly." "Here's one. Did I hear water running someplace near?" She took the box of matches from his hand. It was always that way, she understood, with men who had been badly wounded. A torture and thirst burned in him. She struck a light and looked anxiously around her. The cabin was a wreck indeed. There was no flooring. Half the roof had caved in under the weight of a fallen branch, which thrust a great cluster of dead boughs and twigs into the building. Red rust was eating the remnants of an iron stove to dust in the corner. In another space there was a bunk built against the wall. It must have been 2 or more years since that place was inhabited, yet by the bunk stood a singularly vivid memento of the man who had once dwelt there. It was a candlestick, with a short section of time-yellowed candle still in it. Here her match burned out. With a second one she lighted the candle. Not too much light," Haines gasped. "I want to die away from 'em. I don't want 'em around me yapping and asking questions. Put something around it, and a little water." His voice was cut away by another cough, and she saw his big limbs contracted by a spasm of agony. No doubt that wound was grimly serious, but water seemed to her the most crying deed. Not 10 steps from the door she found the pump, still used by random passer-byers, it appeared, for it was primed. She filled Haines's canteen with clear, cool water and brought it back to him. He caught it with great shaking hands that spilled half the contents down his breast. She had to hold it for him, and his eyes made her shudder. They were like the tortured eyes of a dumb beast dying in agony. But this creature who lay mute was a man. After that she looked to his wound. The whole right side was adrip with blood, and when she cut away the shirt with his own knife, she saw a purple-rimmed hole. Blackness swam across her eyes. Then she got swaying to her feet. "I'll have a doctor here in 1 minute." He shook his head with such an expression of earnest entreaty in his face that she paused. "All this needs is to be plugged to stop bleeding. After that, I'll be all right. You can't be sure, and when I see it, I know you've never seen a fella clipped with a slug before, but this is nothing. Leaves you weak for a little while. After that, when the blood stops running, a man's all right. I'll be walking around in an hour." She studied his face anxiously, but he smiled back at her, and she dropped to her knees beside him. "Then tell me what to do. Tell me how to help you. If I had a pad of cloth." She turned from him, ripped away her underskirt, and tore it into strips. He followed her movement, nodding with a sort of weak admiration. "Very strong for a girl," he said. "Very strong. Never would dream it from the size of your wrists." She wondered that he could say such things, but after all, she decided that he must be very familiar with wounds and must know that this one was not deadly. She made pads of the cloth. With his own hands, he placed those pads over the wound behind and the wound in front. Then she tied that bandage around him, drawing it to such a point of tightness as he demanded. After that, he wanted water again. She brought it, and again held that canteen to his lips. Some of the pain had gone from his eyes now, and in that place there was a shadow, like sleepiness, very like it. She was rejoiced when he smiled faintly at her, and in her happiness, smiling back at him, she took one of his hands and cherished it between both her own. Well, folks, things are happening here. I don't know if Harry's going to make it very far, and don't know if Lee Haynes is going to make it very far. It looks like Jones in the middle of this one, as you'd expect. Next week, we'll read some more of it. In the meantime, you all have a good Christmas. And don't forget, and what makes a really good gift, just something to have around the house this time of year, is those cowboy caramels. Give them a try, folks. Well, until I talk to you again, which will be soon, you can be sure of that, have a Merry Christmas. Now, this is Clay Steele.